everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today is Thanksgiving in Canada, at least it is at time of recording. Thanksgiving is a time of the year where we come together with friends and family and we reflect on all the things that we have to be thankful for in the last year. For us in particular, we can certainly be thankful that we still have the ability to play airsoft. Between a global pandemic shutting down fields and a potential government bill that might have banned airsoft in Canada, it could certainly have been a lot worse. However, airsoft in Canada got through both of these things relatively unscathed, and it's certainly something that we are both thankful for.
And as a result, you get to keep listening to us talk about it, because
right.
No airsoft means no podcast, probably.
Yeah, that's pretty much sums it up. So in any case, we're both thankful for these things. We thought we would mention them on the podcast. But for this episode, we're actually going to turn our attention to something that we are certainly not thankful for, which is the oncoming frosty season. Winter is coming, as they say. And for us, that means a few months pause for outside games. Now, we know lots of airsofters still play airsoft in the winter. I mean, if you live in a country like, a Nordic country like Sweden or Norway, you might play airsoft in the dead of winter. So it's not just people who live in more temperate climates who play airsoft all year long. However, for us, it's really something that we've started to slow down on over the last couple of years. And there's several reasons for that, which is what we're going to get into in this episode.
It turns out that playing airsoft in the winter has a higher opportunity cost than you necessarily would like it to a lot of the time.
Yeah, for sure. So just to put some context around what winter means for us here in Newfoundland. So in St. John's in particular, where we both reside, where we play airsoft, winters tend to have a fair amount of snow. It's not uncommon for us to get several meters of snow throughout the winter. Now, I know people who live in Nordic countries are like, that's not a very large amount of snow. Fair enough. But for us, it is substantial. The temperatures don't tend to be very, very cold. Probably in the vicinity of like -8 to -15 degrees Celsius is a pretty standard, I'd say, average temperature from the months of January to about, March or so. And then in December and November and then in April and May, it's either going to be negative single digits nearing on zero, somewhere around there. So not super, super cold, but definitely sub-zero temperatures for several months out of the year.
And our proximity to the Atlantic Ocean means that we end up with kind of a relatively temperate winter in terms of how cold it gets, but also a very wet one.
Yeah, it gets very sloppy. Driving conditions during most snowfall is generally not advisable. Like it's not, and it's not like we're not equipped for snow. Like most vehicles have snow tires, all this kind of stuff. But it's just, the roads get very slippery. They're hard to manage. It's just not a good time.
It's a great season for indoor hobbies.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people really do love the winter because they enjoy a whole slew of outdoor activities like skiing, snowshoeing, maybe like going out on the snowmobile or something like that. But even those types of hobbies here in our area in St. John's, it's not like super ideal. We don't have ski slopes. The nearest ski slope is a several hours drive away. And there aren't that many good like snowmobile trails and, cross-country skiing trails near enough the city. And quite frankly, the weather conditions aren't optimal for that either. I mean, I have a set of snowshoes. My wife and I do. We've gone snowshoeing. I mean, maybe last year we went like once, maybe twice, I think, because the conditions have to be right. And because the humidity is so high, because it gets so sloppy, you don't necessarily get the ideal conditions to go out. So all that amounts to ultimately being outside in the winter where we live kind of sucks.
It's not fun as such. Which is not to say that you can't have fun with it. I also have gone hiking with snowshoes and, cross-country skied and stuff. But it's not a commonly applicable thing here. In other parts of the province, you can snowshoe, you can ski, you can ice fish very, very readily. But again, because of our proximity to the Atlantic Ocean, which keeps us comparatively somewhat warmer during the winter, it doesn't work out to being dry enough a lot of the time or frozen enough a lot of the time to facilitate those. And so you end up with a lot of wet snow and a lot of mud and slush and just, ugh.
Absolutely. And, one constant of our winters, especially even here in St. John's, is wind. We get a lot of wind, which for airsoft, whether it's in the warm season or the cold season, wind is the enemy of an airsofter.
Have you ever pulled the trigger and had your BB hit you after coming out of the barrel?
Yeah.
That is a Newfoundland thing.
Yeah, we joke like umbrellas are useless here because when it's rainy, it's also windy. And the winter is no exception. It's extremely windy. Your BBs go sideways. It's just not a great time. Now, that being said, both of us have played airsoft in the winter, more than on more than one occasion. There were years, especially when we were starting out, like we wanted to play all year long, and our community was small enough that we could always, rope at least a couple people to go out and play.
If a large game is 8 people, then yeah, hey, we got 5 guys, wicked, let's do it.
Totally, absolutely. So that being said, there are other places where people still play airsoft and it's not as sloppy. You do have the good winter conditions where you can get out there and you can play in the snow and all this kind of stuff and stay relatively dry. But one of the factors right out the gate about playing in the wintertime and playing in the snow is you are going to get wet. Unless you're wearing really good quality outdoor clothing that is meant for being outdoors in the winter, you are going to get wet in some way, shape, or form, because what's going to happen is you're going to get snow on you and your body heat will melt that snow and it's going to make you wet.
And frankly, where we live, even if you have excellent outdoor gear, which has not necessarily been the case a lot of the time when we've played airsoft in the outdoors in the winter, you're still going to get wet. Like, you can shell out hundreds of dollars for good snowmobiling gear and you will still come home and be able to wring it out.
Yeah, and your gear will get wet, like your airsoft gun, your mags, all that stuff is going to get wet by virtue of the fact of being in the snow, being around the snow that's melting because it's around your body, all of those things. Not to mention the fact that if you have an AEG, your AEG motor is getting hot and that's melting the snow. It's nice to keep your hand warm, one of your hands at least, but...
The other hand is gripping metal, which is just so good at keeping your hand warm.
Yeah. So, the first place that we can talk about playing in the winter, of course, is the warmth aspect. Staying warm is a challenge, right? Especially if it's very cold where you live, you may need multiple layers. Again, because it's very humid here, you can dress in multiple layers, and if there's a nice breeze or anything like that, it basically blows right through you. So you really need multiple layers. You need a base layer, you need a warming layer, you need some sort of outer shell to try and keep you as dry as possible.
And to cut the wind as much as possible.
And to cut the wind as much as possible. And then once you start getting wet, if you get wet on the inside, you start getting cold.
Yeah, you're done. There's no way to deal with that won't end up with you being just cold and miserable.
Totally. And let's remember, your sweat is also a form of moisture. So if you're on the field and you're trucking around and you're starting to sweat because you're running around and stuff, that moisture gets inside you and you get wet as well, right?
And you end up with a situation where basically you're going to get wet from sweat from running around, and assuming that everything else is going perfectly, right? Assuming all of your other gear is working as well as it possibly could be, you're still going to be damp and miserable as soon as you stop moving. Now, If you're snowshoeing or skiing, this is not really a big issue, right? Because you're ideally sort of doing some sort of, hike or traverse that's leading you from point A to point B, and either to a car, from a car to a car, or from a car back to that car, which means that you can warm up and get dry, right? And you can get inside. The problem with airsoft, as we all know, is that there are cooldown periods, right? So the period where everyone stops to have a chat in the middle of the game, in between games, is longer than we'd like sometimes. I think that's true for everyone. But it is extremely problematic in the winter, because if it's long enough that you start to actually cool down, you get cold here. And I mean, one of our longstanding places of play is particularly problematic for this, right? Because when we played at Red Cliff, we were playing on a cliff overlooking the North Atlantic Ocean, getting a tremendous amount of wind, and it is a cold spot.
Totally.
I've been up there with a little fire going in really quite good cold weather gear. aside from my boots, which we'll come to later in the episode. And man, it's really hard to stay warm if you're not moving around.
Yeah, and it's not just the periods in between games. Like one of the games that we've played historically for many years, like they didn't run it in the last couple of years because of pandemic and stuff like that, but is the Battle for Stalingrad game at Frontline, which is usually the weekend of like March 17th, like around St. Patty's Day or somewhere there. So it's like the third week of March, third weekend of March. And that usually is sort of like the start or the tentative start of the season, depending on how much snow is down. But every time we've played it, there's always been a fair amount of snow on the ground. And it's an all-day kind of game. You're out there, you're running around, but you're also stealthing because you're, running from cover to cover, you're engaging a target, and then maybe you take out that target, but your team hasn't advanced to the capture points. So now you're waiting for them to come to you. So again, you're cooling off. Or maybe, like I've done it before, where I'm in a commander sort of role. So I'm actually not on the front lines fighting. I'm sort of in the rear with the gear, so to speak.
And the gear does not include a space heater.
Well, yeah, the gear does not include a space heater. So I'm 2 or 3, let's say, positions behind the front line. I'm sort of directing traffic, try to figure out, where are my guys? What does the line look like? Where are they pushing? Where are we pushing? Trying to organize all of that stuff. And so I'm on the radio. I'm trying to move people around. I'm trying to do this, that, the other thing. And one of the things that I'm not doing is moving around myself. Like, yeah, I'm behind a piece of cover. I'm looking with my eyes. I'm talking to people, but I'm not using my legs to go anywhere realistically. And in very short order, you start to get cold because it is cold, right? I mean, it's minus 12 degrees or whatever, and you don't have any physical activity on the go. So you start to get chilly. And I'm wearing as much warm clothing as I can, but I also want to try and wear, let's call it tactical equipment. So I'm wearing a pair of like long johns, like a base layer or something like that, with a warming layer, and I've got my BDU trousers on top of all of that. And then on my top, I've got, the base layer, and I've got a warming layer, and then I've got like a soft shell jacket, like to break the wind and stuff, and my plate carrier on top of that and whatnot. But like, that is not really great equipment if you're going to actually be static. If you're going to be static, you need to wear even more layers. And that's not tactical. That's not even tactical. It's just Michelin Man, right? You're just a big, huge lump of clothing, which is not ideal, right? Because again, I'm not an outdoorsy kind of person in the winter. Like, yeah, we go snowshoeing and stuff, but I'm not the kind of person who's going to drop several $1,000s on really high quality outdoor equipment made for the winter.
And let's be real, even if you were wearing, or had access to, I should say, not wearing, if you had access to a $400, $500 winter parka that'll keep you warm in those conditions, you're still not going to want to wear it to airsoft because it's going to get shot and potentially punctured. Totally. And get paintball crud all over it and mud all over it and dirt all over it. And, you're not paying $400 for that jacket to beat the hell out of it, really. Like, winter gear like that, I mean, yes, it's robust, but it's not meant to take that kind of attrition very well necessarily.
Yeah. And you can go to an army surplus store and you can get surplus extreme cold weather like equipment, right, from different militaries, like the Canadian military. The Canadian military has excellent cold weather equipment, but it's still relatively expensive, and it's really not, it's not sort of where I'm going to spend my money. Right. If I'm really being honest about it, right? Like, if you give me $400 or $500 to go spend on airsoft stuff, it's not going to be cold weather gear because we don't play enough cold weather games to really make it worthwhile. Right.
And one thing we haven't mentioned here that, especially for those games in March, is worthwhile. So towards what most places consider to be spring, we start getting a lot of freezing rain. And a lot of sort of melt and then refreeze. So in addition to any place you'd be playing airsoft here in March having a significant amount of snow on the ground, often 3 to 4 feet of snow in some places where it's sort of drifted, you also end up with a ton of ice. And that is very rough on your face when you slip and fall on it. But that can also be extremely rough on your rifle if you happen to fall on it, because airsoft guns, as we've talked about before, are cool toys, but they're toys. They're not meant to take, a 200-pound guy coming down on the barrel with the barrel hitting on the ice, right? And we've seen that happen, and that's awful.
Yeah. And we'll talk about the particular problematic aspects of airsoft guns in the winter a little bit later, but coming back to like your clothing and stuff, I mean, we've talked about this many times on the podcast before, but like your boots are super important, right? For the longest time, we just wore multiple pairs of socks and then our desert boots, and guess what? That sucks, right? Bottom line, that's not what it's meant for.
Like, I've done survival courses for the winter. I don't know what I was thinking, right? Like desert boots, 3 pairs of wool socks is absolutely the worst thing I have ever done to my feet in the winter here.
Yeah.
You get wet, you get cold. They provide no resistance to any portion of the environment. And kind of unsurprisingly, given that the treads are designed to grip sand well, they're awful on snow and ice. So it's just, it becomes a comedy of errors very, very quickly. And it really also takes the fun out of things. We've worn them in sort of December here, pre-snowfall, and played airsoft in just like, fairly cold, -5, -10 Celsius kind of conditions, but nothing brutal in terms of like ice and snow on the ground. And it was still a terrible idea to be wearing those boots in those circumstances, just in terms of how cold your feet got and how miserable it made you for no reason.
Yeah, and to be fair, like the first few times we did it, we're like, yeah, we're hardcore, this is great, blah, blah. Let me tell you, that loses its charm real fast. Like you do that a couple of times, and then after that, like maybe I don't just want to be frozen half to death for the rest of the day for, like Pat was saying, no good reason. Like really, when you're on the field, I remember there was one game we were reffing or something, and I was just standing at a CP, and I was wearing my desert boots, and my feet felt like icicles, right? And I'm just like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be doing this. This is no fun for anyone. The only thing I'm thinking about is going home. And like, that's not a good headspace to be in. And let's be completely clear. Like, if you are frozen to the bone, if you are not comfortable, if you are wet and soggy and miserable, you're not having a good time. And you're probably not a great person to be hanging around with either, to be honest. If you want a recipe
for grumpy Pat who no one wants to be around, like Pat who's pretty sure his toes are blue is not the best play. Yeah. And like that game, we were both reffing, right? And it was just like, oh yeah, it's the end of November. We're dressed up as warmly as we can, but we're still, again, on a cliff in Newfoundland, or if we're at frontline in a low-lying swamp in Newfoundland, which in fairness is like 50% of the possible terrain here in general.
Yeah, that's true.
Take your pick. Would you like a cliff or a swamp? That's what we got. But yeah, it was miserable, and miserable without a purpose, in the sense that the guys who were playing were also not having, relatively speaking, that much fun.
Yeah, because they're frozen and cold too.
So the guys who are playing are cold, and like they're going, man, this is an okay day of airsoft, but like, why did Phil and Pat organize this? And Phil and Pat are going, oh my God, I'm so cold. Why am I here?
And it's kind of dumb, especially because it's preventable, right? Like if you take the time to research the kind of gear that you really need to use and make sure that you're using the best possible gear for the situation. So, I mean, that means not using desert boots. That means wearing the appropriate like parka or, base layers and all of this stuff. Like you have control over that. And if you can't get that equipment and you don't have access to it, well, that's certainly one thing, but you may want to consider whether or not this is something you're going to want to make a regular occurrence of. And for us, that was sort of the bottom line. Like we didn't really care to play that much in the winter at the end of it, like once we'd done it a lot, and investing the money to be able to do so also didn't seem particularly appealing, which is why in a large part of it, we just really don't play that much in the wintertime, outdoors in the wintertime, I should say. But we'll talk about that a bit later.
One thing I definitely will point out here, right? Like my current boots are, Gore-Tex lined hikers. They're super warm in the winter. They're waterproof. They're not like heavily winterized hiking boots. They're probably a fall, early winter hiker. And they are several orders of magnitude more comfortable in cold weather than my desert boots were. And I think just that would have made the whole process at least enjoyable enough for us to keep doing it perhaps a little longer. But I don't think it would
a couple hours or something.
Exactly. But I don't think it would have resolved the other issue, right? Which is I'm not spending $500 on cold weather gear to play airsoft games in. Sorry. Yeah. Like it's just not a thing I want to do that much for some reasons we're going to get into now.
Yeah, and I mean, that being said, if you live somewhere where cold weather games are the norm, then you can certainly have that gear. You might even already have it, and then you get some overwhites and you throw them on top of that. Maybe that's your solution. This just really wasn't really it for us. Now, that being said, if you are looking to play winter games and it is cold and you have a cold, snowy climate like we do have in Canada, really your number one priority needs to be to stay dry and therefore stay warm. If you are wet, it is not going to be possible for you to stay warm, right? So your number one priority needs to be to stay dry.
Gore-Tex is your friend.
Yeah, and like any sort of survival instructor, anyone who spends any amount of time outdoors in the Canadian winter will tell you the first thing you need to do is make sure you stay dry. The second part of that is staying warm. And one of the ways that you can stay warm, we talked about, is the gear. Another way that you can help yourself stay warm is by consuming warm things, including, warm drinks or warm food.
A good thermos full of tea or coffee is so nice.
Totally. That's like a clutch piece that we've always done, is making sure you have a thermos, and a good thermos, right? Not one that will lose its heat over like 45 minutes. Like it doesn't have to be particularly branded, but like Thermos branded stuff tends to be pretty good. Of course, if you're full of money, you can go buy a Yeti or whatever. Like those will keep the heat for like 14 days or something crazy. I don't really know, but they're like really, really good. So you can get thermoses that will keep your drink warm, and having one on hand is a really, really good solution. Tea, coffee, whatever, even just hot water. Some people will even say, well, you can take like packets of Jello and pour the Jello in the hot water, and that will give you like a sugar hit, because of course you consume more calories because you're trudging around the snow and stuff. So certainly something you can do. And then you get just like hand warmers and stuff that you can stuff on your boots or your gloves or whatever, just to help you stay warm.
Those little consumable chemical hand warmers are definitely also a fun thing to have for that. We definitely use them a bunch in terms of when we did play in the winter more often, partly because one of the problems that you run into playing in the winter in general is weapons handling in big cozy gloves is not a thing. So it's very important to keep your hands warm, but you're often, holding a metal object in essentially your thin tactical gloves because you need the manual dexterity to manipulate your airsoft gun.
Yeah. Like the best glove you can be wearing is like a mitten, right? And, we call them trigger mittens, but it's like a mitten that has the index finger cut out. And not cut out, but I mean like made separate, right? You're not exposing your skin, obviously, which those are fine to keeping your hands a little bit warmer. But like Pat was saying, like it's not great to be able to do any sort of fine motor control using bigger, thicker gloves, right? If you want dexterity, you need thin gloves, but thin gloves aren't really going to keep you warm unless you're, again, being physically active. Like if I go for a run outside in the winter, I can wear thin gloves, no problem, because my hands will heat up just from the exercise. But if you're playing airsoft and you're going to be sitting around for extended periods, again, you need a glove that will actually, just by its insulating properties, keep your hands warmer. Not to mention the fact that if you're like me, your hands, if you have poor circulation or something, your hands might get cold faster than other parts of your body. So you really need to double down, and having a bit of a hand warmer you can just tuck in there can certainly help you stay warm.
I used a coat for a really long time that had a sort of breast pocket that I could slip my hands into that would put them underneath my chest rig. So it was nice and insulated, and I was able to steal some of my core body heat back from my hands. That was good. Yeah. But, obviously not practical while shooting at anybody.
Yeah. So you've got the staying dry aspect. You've got the staying warm aspect, but then you also have the other aspect of like staying tactical, right? Staying concealable. And I mentioned overwhites briefly. If you do get a lot of snow, you may want to consider getting some sort of camouflage that matches your environment. White camo is obviously very good if you do have a lot of snow. If you have a little bit less snow, you may want to consider something that is a bit more like area appropriate, right? So not just white, but white with gray or white with brown, or depending on what your forest looks like. I know they make like a snow pattern Swedish M90 camo, which looks really great. There's different patterns that are available out there, but again, that's an extra expense. The absolute cheapest route is to get overwhites, or even just like a cheap Tyvek suit that you can throw over your kit. And
that's a really effective solution if you have a decent parka that you want to wear, but you will end up feeling kind of roly-poly.
Mm-hmm. That being said, if you're covering all of your gear with it, then you need to understand that it's going to limit your access to your mags, for example, if you get into a firefight. So then you need to put the your plate carrier, for example, your load bearing equipment on top of your overwhites and all this kind of stuff. So there's a management piece here to your kit. But suffice it to say that if you are frequently going to be playing in the winter, you're going to need some sort of camo solution, including a helmet cover if you do wear a helmet.
And yeah, you're going to run this stuff anyway, where I've run sort of winter whites over a parka and then strapped my coyote brown vest on over that. And I won't say it makes the camo useless, but the big brown blob wandering around is fairly visible.
Yeah. So you just need to be conscious of all that stuff when you're making that decision. But fundamentally, again, like, part of the reason that we don't really play as often in the winter, because all this management aspect doesn't really do a whole lot for us. And like Pat was saying, like, if everyone is going out and no one is really having a good time, at some point you got to wonder, like, is it really worthwhile to be doing this, right? And like I was saying before, yeah, sure, the first few times that you do it, you're like, yeah, we're hardcore, this is great, it's -10, it's -20, we're going out there, we're doing all this stuff. And that's all fine and dandy, but that loses its charm after a few times when you're really cold, your hands are icicles, you come home, like you have a shower and like the water is so warm that it actually hurts you. Like all this kind of stuff that is an absolute reality of playing outside all day in the cold.
I ultimately end up coming back in terms of this specific piece to I'd rather go snowshoeing if I can, or frankly go for a run. Running in the winter here is not too bad because the snow clearing is usually relatively decent for a while. Those are more fun. And if it comes down to it, after a certain point in the winter here, I'm just going to go play Warhammer because the store I play Warhammer at is heated. Yeah. And being outside for 8 hours playing airsoft is just terrible. And the notion, it's like, oh yeah, we're really badass, was definitely a component of it for a long time. But one of the things that I've realized as I've become more of a seasoned airsofter is that at the end of the day, I'm not getting paid to do this, right? Like the parts of being a soldier that suck, soldiers are at least getting paid to do.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the aspects we touched on briefly, and I said we'd come back to it, is just the wear and tear on your gear as well. Like your airsoft guns in particular. If you're using plastic guns, for example, the colder it gets, the more brittle the plastic gets. That's chances that your guns will sustain some sort of damage. We'll go into the specifics of that in a second. But there's also the fact that if you use gas guns, like a propane gun, you could forget about using it in the winter. It's not going to work, right? So right out the gate, if I'm going to a game in the wintertime, I know I can't use my grenades. I know I can't use my sidearm. I can only use my AEG, right? And as a consequence of the cold, there's a number of different things that are going to occur to my AEG. The first of which is that my battery life will not be as long, because we know that batteries, as they get cold, they don't hold a charge quite as long, and I'm oversimplifying, but basically you get fewer shots on a single battery, so I need to have more batteries. That's number one. That's also going to apply to my optic. My optic the batteries are going to die sooner. That's also going to apply to my GoPro. It's also going to apply to my radio. Anything that's battery operated is not going to last as long. So I have to have many more spares than I would at a random game in, let's say, plus degree weather. That's the first aspect of it. The second aspect is that other parts of my kit that are flexible, such as my hop-up rubber on my barrel, will start to constrict because of, again, the cold. And as a consequence of that, my hop-up will not hop as much. I need to adjust my gear. I need to make sure that my hop-up is suitable to be using at these temperatures, because not all hop-ups are meant to be used at lower temperatures. All of these things are things I need to take into consideration before I even hit the field. And
then we start getting into the more mechanically complicated problems that come with it, right? I mentioned earlier you slip, you fall, you break your gun being just hard times, and more likely if you're here because we get a lot of ice. But as we've talked about, the components for these guns are not necessarily tremendously well made. They're not necessarily of the highest quality, right? So especially after you've gone in and tinkered with them and upgraded them, they're working on still kind of iffy tolerances after being upgraded, which is not to say that I expect a gun to be more likely to fail after I tinker with it, just that I've changed the tolerances and made it more precise. And so the cold adjusting the size of all of the metal inside of it at once is a problem, because not everything contracts at the same rate. right?
Yep. And some of the parts are plastic. And you might say, well, Phil, I upgraded all the parts of my gun. Not a single part in my gearbox is plastic anymore. Really? Not a single part? Not even your tappet plate? Your tappet plate is not plastic? Guaranteed it is. Right? And guess what happens to plastic? It gets more brittle. So who says that your tappet plate doesn't snap? Or maybe even the little piece of plastic that holds your spring in place, that snaps off. That's totally feasible.
During a period here where a great many of the locals were using sort of the pneumatic blowback systems that G&G made, you ended up with a tremendous amount of, there's extra issues with gearbox cracking, right? The gearbox is more brittle. It can't take as hard a hit. Firing a whole lot still. I'm actually firing more than I usually would because the hop up and air seal have all gone sort of wonky because parts have contracted. So you're losing a lot of the functionality of your gun and you're exposing it to tremendously increased amounts of wear. And, yes, you can totally play airsoft outside in, -10 and have no problems. Sure. But every time you do, you're increasing the load and the risk on your gun. If you're using something with plastic bearings, with a plastic gearbox, you're in terrible trouble. If you're using something with a plastic exterior, you can have the force from just pulling the trigger crack the front of your actual rifle shell, which will be horrendous. It means you're basically buying a new gun, or at least the external parts of a new gun. And it's not worth it, is my personal view. If you are going to play in the winter, you're going to have a lot more success with the reinforced gearbox. You're going to have a lot more success, ideally, honestly, with like a version 3 AK platform, because they're just chunkier pieces of metal and they're therefore better able to withstand it. But the attrition and the extra just risk to all of your components of your entire gun is a thing you really need to think about. And especially as our gear has gotten better upgraded and more expensive, I at least have become increasingly like, I'm not sure I want to take this out in -15 and have it break in a really like critical fashion.
Totally. And that's not a risk that we're actually willing to take anymore. And it's not just the last couple of years. I remember when my wife and I got married in 2015, it was in March, and we had my bachelor party, which is like a stag party or whatever, like the day before. Maybe not the day before, but the week before. Actually, it's definitely not the day before because it's very fuzzy. I don't remember a whole lot from it. So it probably likely.
It was about a week before.
Yeah.
I was the DD, so I actually remember the day significantly better than Phil.
I remember the start of it. It's just the end that got a little fuzzy.
I'm a little proud of the fact that when I dropped him home, he told his wife he'd had such a great time, but he couldn't actually tell her who had dropped him home. It's good.
Yeah. So
as the best man, I felt that I'd done my job well.
But what I do remember from that day was we did play airsoft. So many of us came out to the field. Even my brother, who's like basically has never really played a sensible game of airsoft in his life. He came out and,
I think that's actually probably the closest he's come to playing a sensible game of airsoft. And man, was it not a sensible game of airsoft?
No. And so we went out. It was March, like early March 2015. So, over 6 years ago now. And so we played airsoft and we did not use our guns. We actually rented guns from the field. And the reason we did that was because we didn't want to take any chances with our own equipment. And to be completely clear, we were not drinking at all at that point. Like we were all completely stone cold sober. But we didn't want to take any chances with our own stuff. We're like, you know what? Let's just get the rentals. That way we're, $20 extra each rather than having to potentially take the chance of doing any damage to our own kit. And we played lots of different games. We'd had a great time. Like it was excellent. But it was also really goofy because those guns were not shooting really great. Like it was not a good time from a marksmanship perspective. Let's call it
30-foot effective range on an MP5 that was in need of some TLC kind of game.
Definitely, but it was fun. It was hilarious. Totally. But again, like we were not prepared. It was snowy. It was icy. We weren't prepared to risk our own airsoft guns on that, because if anything were to happen, and it happens very easily, you slip and fall and suddenly you're tumbling into a building or into a rock or into a ravine or something like that, and then you just smash your gun off something and then stuff breaks. Like it's just not worth it. And it's even more hazardous in the wintertime than it is at other times of the year, right? So 5 years ago, we were still renting guns at that time. like we during the winter to play games, because it's not something we want to risk our own kits for. For the larger op games, we would sometimes still run our kits, although some of us did rent as well.
But it just comes down to building like our cost without anyone paying me for the tech work. Building one of our rifles costs about $600 Canadian. If we can get all the parts we want at sort of the regular prices, which isn't always the case. If you fall and break that in half, you're out $600. There's nothing I can do. If something fails, it can eat most of the internals in the gearbox if it's the wrong thing, right? Or at least it can eat like half of them. So you're in, again, a bunch of money. That is something to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a whole lot of reasons that we choose not to play airsoft in the wintertime anymore. That's not to say that if you enjoy airsoft in the winter, you're wrong. Obviously, there's a lot of countries around the world that have a long winter season, much longer than ours, and you may find yourself having to play in the winter.
Yeah, I remember watching some guys in Alaska post videos of them playing and photos of them playing. Probably back in like 2013. And just thinking, man, they've got a really like great area to play. All their stuff is working really well, but they also clearly had good outdoor gear that we didn't. And their climate is, I imagine, a little different from ours.
For sure. If you live in a place like Alaska or Scandinavia or Finland or the Nordic countries and all this kind of stuff, far be it for you to take lessons from us about how to deal with your winter. This really is more targeted at people who live in climates similar to ours, that have winter similar to ours, where you get sub-zero temperatures. You're like, oh yeah, it's my first season playing airsoft. I can just hit the field. There's definitely things that you want to consider before you do that, because you may find it's much harder than what you initially anticipated. That's what we found. That's been our experience. Now, your mileage, of course, will certainly vary. But for our money, it's something that we don't really spend a whole lot of time doing. Now, does that mean that we will never play in the winter? Of course not. If Battle for Stalingrad is done this year, in 2022, we will go, almost certainly, assuming schedules permits and all that kind of stuff. But we will go regardless of the weather, but we will be much more equipped now than we have been in the past, because we've made some better decisions about equipping ourselves to do that.
But if you live somewhere with a relatively mild winter, I lived in England near London for a little while, and I've experienced their winter, and it was, compared to home, quite pleasant. I could often get by with, a warm sweater, gloves, and a hat kind of thing. You still need to think about keeping warm and keeping dry. You still need to apply those sort of lessons. And we've talked about them very briefly today, but I think that if you are considering playing airsoft in the winter, you really do want to go read a book or take a course, or at worst watch some YouTube videos on winter survival wherever you live. Yeah. Because it's really not a thing to mess around with, right? This is definitely one of those respect Mother Nature, because having your fingers and toes all still attached at the end of the day is great.
Yeah. So how do we do it then? How do we stay on top of our airsoft game when there's several months at a time that we're not going to play? It could be 3 months, it could be 4 months. In some cases, in 2020, for example, when we had our quote unquote Snowmageddon, it was, I think, up to 5 months that we couldn't play because we had so much snow, so much ice. It took so long for it all to melt. Well, we've talked about it a lot in our videos and the podcast before. There's personal skills that you can work on at home, and you don't need to spend any money to do it. It costs you absolutely nothing to do ready ups, once a week, once every couple of days, if your schedule permits, once every 2 weeks at the absolute minimum, for you to spend half an hour or an hour just cranking out ready ups on both sides, right? Strong side, off side. You can do reload drills. You can do that at home. You can do ready ups with reloads. You can do that in front of your couch and just dump the mag onto your couch. You can do shoulder transitions. You can work on cover utilization. You can work on sidearm transitions.
You can do all of this with a couch.
You can, like anything that you need to drop, you can drop
baby.
it. Well, yeah, you can do it. Yeah, that's right. You can use the couch as cover, but you can also, I'm thinking more like dropping, if you're trying to drop a mag or drop a pistol mag or even drop a grenade, you want to like practice retrieving it from your belt and deploying it. You can just, instead of tossing it on the ground, which is hard, just toss it on the couch and just have that catch
If you are going to
your
frag
mags
the
for you.
couch, remember to warn the girlfriend.
Yeah.
Hint,
I
hint.
would not recommend deploying a tornado inside your house if you can avoid it.
Lots of sweeping.
Totally. But these are things that you absolutely can do at home. And these are things that I personally do myself in months when I know that I'm not going to be playing airsoft. That's very, very important. It's dry fire training. And dry fire training is absolutely a gateway into higher personal performance. There's no two ways about it. If you go on YouTube, you can look up the T-Rex Arm channel, and on that channel, they did a shooting day, or I think a couple of shooting days, with this Japanese airsofter who, in Japan, you can't own firearms the way that you can in the United States, certainly not in the United States, and even like in Canada. And so the only thing he'd ever done was airsoft, right?
Firearms are extremely restricted in Japan.
Yeah, so he had no firearms, actual firearms experience at all. They took him out to the range. They gave him a Glock or whatever it is that he was using, and they're like, "All right, do some drills." And aside from the recoil mitigation, the like actually controlling the weapon, within a very short amount of time, he was doing reloads, ready ups, all this kind of stuff, just as good as they could possibly expect. Well, way better than they could possibly expect. And to listen to Lucas, the host of this particular episode, better than like 90% of shooters that he typically sees at a course, just from airsoft, right? And that is the equivalent of dry fire training. And you can do that at home. You can get that good at home by taking the practice. So yes, are you going to be able to practice team movement by yourself with nobody in your house? No, of course not. Are you going to be able to practice utilizing different pieces of cover that you have at your field at your house? No, of course not. Can you simulate some of that? Sure, you can take a knee, you can go prone, you can do a bunch of stuff. But ultimately, it's not going to be as flexible. However, you can absolutely keep your performance up so that when the calendar pages flip and you get to the first outdoor game of the season, which could be April, it could be May, or what have you, your skills are still relatively sharp and you hit the ground running. Now, that's if you don't have any alternative where you can actually play indoors. And here in St. John's, we're fortunate enough, there is an indoor field. It's not something that I personally enjoy, so I don't tend to frequent the indoor field. However, if you have access to an indoor field, perhaps you can set it up so that you have team training at your indoor field. Which we absolutely have done. We've also been fortunate enough that we have a team member on the team who has access to a warehouse. We can't do any shooting in the warehouse, but we can do dry fire training. We can do team movement training. We can do painting. We can do a whole bunch of team building stuff in that space. So there's a lot of different opportunities that exist to keep your airsoft skills sharp, even if you're not hitting the field every week or every second week, going outdoors or whatever.
And for the airsoft techs in the room, or people who are interested in airsoft teching, one of the key things here also is winter is our upgrade season, right? Winter is all right. Well, we're not using these all the time, so let's iron out the issues that people are having, if any. Yes, you guys have listened to the saga of Phil's gun, and or at least long-term listeners have, and you know that sometimes that continues into the full game season, but usually not, right? So for this winter, once the season closes out, I know that Chris wants me to work on his rifle and make some modifications to it, to work on a backup that he has access to bring it up to sort of par, so that we have an additional backup that's just, as good as our primary rifles, and there's no problem if someone's rifle goes down, we just sling that at them and they go. I'm going to tinker with a couple of my own pieces of gear. This is also a really useful thing you can do in the winter, right? The post, if you're living in Canada, I know, gets slower, but the work can be done and you have more time to do it, right? So it means that I can dedicate time where normally I'd be like, oh, well, Saturday morning and afternoon I play airsoft. Well, okay, so maybe Saturday morning and afternoon I work on airsoft guns.
Absolutely. Not to mention, it's a time to iron out your kit as well. Like maybe you've always wanted to scrim your helmet, and I mean, shout out to Jordan on the Discord. He has a really sweet lid that he's scrimmed using like some sort of like surplus French camo netting or something like that, and it looks really, really good. And that's something that I want to do, but I don't really have the drive and motivation to do it right now. But once airsoft sort of has wound down for the season and I want to get my airsoft kick, sometimes working on my airsoft gear just sort of scratches that itch just enough, right? So that I'm like, yeah, that's good. You know, maybe I'll throw on my gear, do a couple of write-offs. I'm like, yeah, cool. All right.
And yeah, it's a time to tinker with stuff and play with stuff. And, you know, if you want to rearrange where you're carrying your mags and how you have your mag pouches set up, do that, and then do a couple hundred reloads, so that you're practicing in the new setup.
Exactly. Absolutely. So there's lots of options out there. And of course, if you are fortunate enough to play somewhere where you have access to an indoor facility and that's your jam, like you enjoy doing it. Like I said, I don't particularly enjoy it, but lots of people do. And I'm not yucking anybody's yum. Like if that's what you want to do, then absolutely go for it. And if you live somewhere where you are fortunate enough that winter doesn't actually stop your outdoor season because it doesn't actually get that cold. I mean, it might feel cold to you, but by like Canadian standards, it's definitely not that cold, and by Nordic standard, it's certainly not that cold. Yeah. But regardless, all this to say, I mean, if you are fortunate enough to live in a place where it doesn't get that cold, you might actually like it even better. I know there's some guys on the Discord who are from Mexico, and they really like winter airsoft because it actually gets cool down there as opposed to the 30+ degrees centigrade weather that they get most of the year.
It's more comfortable human operating conditions.
Totally. But like I said, if you live in a country that does get snow, these are some things that you're going to want to consider before jumping into outdoor airsoft playing. And if you're looking at doing some sort of airsoft biathlon, well, I don't know what to tell you, but that, as far as I'm aware, does not exist. So you're barking up the wrong tree.
It's an interesting idea, but I think probably stick to the 22. It'll love you more in the winter.
Yeah, absolutely. So guys, thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast. Like we always say, if you want to keep the conversation going, we highly recommend you join the Discord. There's a lot of really great people in there who have a lot of different insights. We have people in there from the Nordic countries. We have a guy in there from Finland, Onion, Sepuli, and he has a lot of experience dealing with winter climates, and I'm sure he'd be happy to help happy to share some of his tips and tricks about winter airsoft playing.
We also assume that at some point he will listen to this podcast episode and have a hearty laugh at our idea of cold.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, we'd love to have you part of the community. It's growing every single day, and we can't thank you enough for engaging in that conversation. We talked about it a few episodes ago on our 52nd episode, but when we think back today, especially on Thanksgiving, thinking about one of the things that we're thankful for, we're super thankful for the Discord, for all of you in our community listening to this podcast, engaging with us, talking about airsoft, and really motivating us to keep making this type of content for you, and really for ourselves if we're being a little bit selfish, because it is fun to get together every once in a while and record some of these podcasts. But so yeah, that's it. That's all we got for you this week. Hopefully you enjoyed, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. And if you're in Canada and having Thanksgiving when you hear this, then eat a lot of turkey for me.
Take care, everyone.